I was still wearing my graduation gown when my father slid an envelope across the dinner table and said it was time I learned what family loyalty really meant. Inside was my name printed beside my cousin Eli's. I thought it was some sort of joke, a ceremonial document, until my mother clasped her hands and said, "It's tradition." My father nodded, his eyes cold but satisfied. "Our families have done this for generations," he said. "It keeps the bloodline strong." Eli sat across from me, 12 years older, smiling like he'd already won something. My stomach twisted. I laughed out of disbelief, but no one joined me. I said, "I'm 17. "You can't be serious." My father said, "This is not about age. It's about duty." My mother said, "You'll thank us one day." Eli leaned closer and whispered, "You'll learn to love me." The chandelier light reflected off the contract like a blade. That was the night I realized I was property. And that was the night I decided I would never belong to anyone again. When I said no, the room changed temperature. My father's hand slammed the table. My mother flinched but didn't stop him. "Don't embarrass this family," he hissed. "You will honor this arrangement." My Aunt Lila looked away, her lips pressed tight, but I saw guilt flicker across her face. I stood, trembling but steady, and said it again louder. No, my mother started crying, saying I was ungrateful. My father called me a foolish child. Eli just smiled. I went in my room that night and locked the door. That's when I heard the soft tap under it, a folded note. It was from Aunt Lila. It said one word, "window." I understood. I waited until the house fell silent. I opened the small pantry window, scraped my hands on the sill, and climbed into the night. My knees were bleeding by the time I reached the road. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't go back. I called the only person I trusted, Mrs. Vaughn, my school counselor, the one who once told me that tradition without choice is just control in disguise. She didn't hesitate. 15 minutes later, her car pulled up. I remember sitting in the passenger seat, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. She said nothing, just drove. When we reached her apartment, she handed me a blanket and tea and said, "You're safe for now." The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Dozens of messages. My mother begging, my father threatening, Eli's text, "We can make this easy." I turned the phone off. Mrs. Vaughn called her friend Nina, a legal aid lawyer. Nina arrived that afternoon with a folder full of forms and a calm voice that cut through panic. She said, "They'll try to paint you as unstable. They'll say you're confused. We'll stay ahead of it." She took my statement, asked for evidence, and promised she'd help file for emancipation. I didn't even know that word before then. It sounded like air. My Aunt Lila sent me scanned papers from an old family file, emails between my parents and Eli, business documents, even notes about money transfers labeled future arrangement. It was proof that my marriage wasn't a union, it was a transaction. Nina looked at the files and said, "They're smart, but not smart enough." We went to court 2 weeks later. I wore borrowed clothes. My parents looked offended, as if they were the victims. The judge asked if I consented to the arrangement. I said no. My father said I was being manipulated. My mother said I didn't understand how the world worked. Nina laid the evidence on the table, screenshots, financials, statements from Aunt Lila, records of Eli's inappropriate messages to other girls. The judge's face didn't move. When she spoke, it was final. The court grants emancipation. All coercive contact must stop immediately. The gavel hit, and just like that, I was free on paper. But freedom isn't simple. Freedom is a room too quiet after years of shouting. It's waking up and realizing no one is calling your name, no one is controlling you, no one is caring for you either. I moved into a small apartment Mrs. Vaughn helped me find. I slept on a mattress on the floor and ate cereal for dinner because I didn't know how to cook for just myself. I stared at my reflection and didn't recognize the girl looking back. She had my face, but none of my fear. Then came the fallout. My family turned the story upside down. "She's been brainwashed," they said. "She's mentally unstable. She's ungrateful." Eli disappeared from social media. My grandmother sent a text saying, "You broke your mother's heart." I replied, she tried to sell mine. My Aunt Lila became my only ally. She told me my parents had been doing this for decades, arranging marriages between cousins and business partners. They call it preserving legacy, she said. I call it greed. The following month, a detective contacted Nina. There were reports against Eli, messages with other minors. My parents tried to cover it up, saying it was fake. But the investigation grew, quiet at first, then louder. I didn't testify publicly, but I gave statements. Eli was eventually arrested for fraud and coercion. My parents' names surfaced in financial audits. They settled quietly. Money can't hide everything forever. I got a job at a small library, stacking books and breathing the kind of silence that doesn't hurt. I took night classes, saving every dollar I could. Sometimes I'd see a girl in the aisles with her mother and wonder if she'd ever have to choose between obedience and survival. I hope not. One night after work, I got a letter. The handwriting was my mother's. I almost threw it away, but curiosity won. It said, I hope someday you'll understand why we did what we did. Family traditions matter. I forgive you for leaving. I laughed so hard I cried. I wrote back one line, I don't need your forgiveness. I needed your protection. Then I tore the letter in half and went for a walk. A year passed. The trial against Eli ended in a plea deal. He avoided jail time but lost everything: his business, his reputation, the trust of everyone who once called him respectable. My parents relocated quietly to another state. I didn't follow the details. I was done letting their consequences fill my life. On my 18th birthday, I changed my last name. I took my mother's maiden name, not as tribute but as reclamation, something mine reshaped. I got accepted into college with a scholarship and decided to study law. Nina wrote my recommendation letter. You've already lived the hardest lesson, she told me. Now you can use it. During freshman orientation, I met a girl named Hannah. She said she'd run away at 16 from a strict religious community. We sat on the dorm steps that night trading stories, realizing how many different names control can have: tradition, duty, obedience. We laughed, even though nothing about it was funny. But laughter felt like survival. One evening, I got an email from Aunt Lila. She said, your mother asked about you. I told her you're doing well. I thought you should know. I didn't reply. I just closed the laptop and sat in the quiet. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is heavy. I was tired of carrying it. Sometimes I still dream about that dinner table. The chandelier. The way my father's ring glinted as he pushed the contract forward. The way my mother looked proud, not because she loved me, but because she thought she'd secured the family's name for another generation. When I wake from that dream, I touch the silver bracelet on my wrist, the one I bought from a thrift shop after my first paycheck. It's simple and cold and mine. It reminds me that love doesn't demand obedience and loyalty doesn't mean silence. If you've ever been told that love means sacrifice, remember this. Real love doesn't need to cost you your freedom. The moment I climbed out that window, I didn't just escape a marriage, I escaped a lifetime of disappearing inside someone else's story. Years passed faster than I expected. I graduated, moved into a small shared apartment near the courthouse where I interned, and began to learn how justice actually works, slowly, painfully, one form at a time. Nina used to joke that law wasn't about victory, it was about endurance. She was right. I spent most days sorting case files and answering calls from people who sounded like I once did, tired, scared, cornered by people who said they loved them. Some nights I stayed late, staring at the city lights outside the office window, wondering if my parents ever looked up at the same skyline and thought about me. Then I'd turn back to the paperwork because the past doesn't deserve that much space. Still, memories have a way of sneaking in when you least expect them. One afternoon, while walking home from court, I passed a jewelry store. In the window was a gold bracelet almost identical to the one my mother had fastened on me the night she tried to seal my fate. My breath caught. For a second, I was 17 again, sitting at that dinner table with all their expectations pressing against my skin. I walked away fast, but my reflection followed me in every window. That night I dreamed of the chandelier again, only this time it fell and shattered, scattering tiny lights across the floor. I woke up crying, but for the first time the tears felt clean. A few months later, I received a letter from a law firm in my hometown. My parents' names were on the envelope. My first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity burned hotter than fear. Inside was a copy of my grandmother's will. She'd passed away quietly, leaving everything to the children who remembered what family means. My name wasn't there. I expected that. What I didn't expect was a short handwritten note paper-clipped to the file. It was from my Aunt Lila. She wanted to leave you something, it said, but your mother refused to sign the amendment. I'm sorry. I tried. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my desk drawer beside the silver bracelet. That night I made peace with something I didn't know was still haunting me, the idea that I needed their approval to exist. I didn't. Around that time I met Daniel, a journalist who came to the legal clinic to interview our team about women's rights cases. He was gentle in a way that didn't demand proof. We spent long hours talking after work, first about articles, then about everything else: childhoods, faith, freedom. When I finally told him the whole story, I waited for pity. Instead, he said, that must have taken a lot of courage. No one had ever used that word for me before. It felt strange, but right. He never asked me to forget what happened. He just reminded me I'd already survived it. For the first time, I started imagining a future that didn't end in fear. One spring weekend, we drove through my hometown. I hadn't been back in almost 8 years. The streets looked smaller, like time had folded them in half. Daniel asked if I wanted to see the old house. I said no at first, then nodded. We parked across the street. The gates were rusted now. The garden, once perfectly trimmed, was overgrown. A for sale sign leaned crooked near the mailbox. I stared at the windows, half expecting to see my mother's silhouette, but the house was empty. It felt less like revenge and more like release. It looks smaller, I whispered. Maybe you grew, Daniel said. Later, we stopped by Aunt Lila's nursing home. Her hair was thinner, but her eyes were the same, sharp and kind. She smiled when she saw me. You're taller, she said. Or maybe I'm shorter. We laughed. She asked about my work, about Daniel, about the world outside. Then she said, your mother tried to find you once. She wanted to see you. I felt my throat tighten. When? 2 years ago. She sent me a letter to give you if you ever came back. She pulled an envelope from a drawer. My name was written in my mother's perfect cursive. I held it for a long time before opening it. It said, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I was wrong. I thought I was protecting our name. I didn't realize I was destroying yours. I hope you built something better. There was no signature, just her initials. I folded the letter, feeling something heavy lift from my chest. It wasn't reconciliation. It was closure. Lila squeezed my hand and said, sometimes sorry comes too late, but it still matters. On the drive home, Daniel asked if I regretted cutting them off. I thought about it for a long moment before saying no. I regret that they made it necessary. He nodded. Silence filled the car, the kind that feels like understanding. That summer, I took on my first solo case, a 16-year-old girl trying to free herself from a forced guardianship. Sitting across from her, I saw pieces of myself, the shaking hands, the cautious eyes. I told her, you're not crazy for wanting to be safe. When the judge granted her independence, she cried and hugged me. As she walked away, I realized this was the life I'd built from the ashes of another. Justice wasn't about winning. It was about giving someone else the chance to breathe. Years rolled on. I married Daniel in a small ceremony under a willow tree by the courthouse. No family names, no contracts, just 2 people choosing each other freely. Mrs. Vaughn was there, older but radiant, the same woman who'd opened her door the night I ran. When she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, you made your own tradition. Every anniversary, I take a walk alone at dawn. I think about the girl I was, terrified, obedient, desperate to please, and I whisper, you did it. The world doesn't change overnight, but sometimes the smallest rebellion can echo for generations. One autumn evening, years later, I stood on the porch of our home watching the leaves fall. Daniel handed me a mug of tea and asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" I smiled. I already did. And I left again, by choice this time. He nodded, understanding that freedom isn't about running away. It's about choosing where to stay. Sometimes, when I meet young women at the clinic, they ask how I knew it was time to leave. I tell them it wasn't one big moment. It was thousands of tiny ones. Every time I was told to be quiet, every time I was told to smile, every time love felt like a leash. The night I climbed out that window was just the first time I listened to myself. Now, at 42, I teach part-time at the university and volunteer at shelters. I tell my students that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a whisper that says, "Not anymore." They usually smile politely, not realizing they're hearing the truest thing I know. A few months ago, I got an email from an unfamiliar address. It was short, just one line: "Your mother passed peacefully last week." There was no sender name, but I knew it was Aunt Lila's nurse. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop, made a pot of tea, and sat by the window. I didn't cry. I just watched the rain. The same kind of rain that fell the night I ran. It sounded softer now. People talk about closure like it's a door you shut. But I've learned it's more like a window you open, not to let the past back in, but to let yourself breathe. My life didn't turn out perfect. It turned out mine. That's enough. So if your family ever calls it destiny while your heart calls it a cage, remember this: tradition isn't sacred if it demands your silence. You don't owe your bloodline your future. You owe yourself a life that's truly yours. When I think back to that night, the chandelier, the envelope, the word no trembling in my throat, I don't see a frightened girl anymore. I see the beginning of everything good that followed. And I know, without hesitation, that walking away was the best decision I ever made. If you were in my place, would you have stayed for the sake of peace, or would you have risked everything for a chance at freedom?